Welcome, comrades. Today we will hear two speeches regarding the imperialist war in Iran, following this introductory note. We will end with a period of question and answers where attendees, both in person and online, can ask questions of party militants regarding the topics presented here. We encourage all those attending online who wish to learn more about the party to visit our website, review our press, and email us if they would like to get more engaged with the work of the party. And for those in person, we have our tables with all of our literature and some back issues of our Communist Party paper. We publish a bi-monthly newspaper, the International Communist Party, and a regular theoretical magazine. Subscriptions can be obtained at clpublishers.com or by request. Our party, the International Communist Party, while today a very small party, is a very old party with deep roots. The question of imperialist war has always been a central issue for our party. We trace our origins to the revolutionary current that emerged within the crisis of the First World War, when the collapse of the Second International revealed the bankruptcy of opportunist social democracy. In 1914, as the parties of the Second International betrayed the working class by voting for war credits and aligning with their national bourgeoisies, the communist left, guided by the teachings of Lenin, upheld the only consistent proletarian position: opposition to imperialist war and the call for revolutionary defeatism. Lenin insisted that war was not an accident by the inevitable result of capitalism in its imperialist stage, and that he insisted that war was not an accident, but the inevitable result of capitalism in its imperialist stage, and that the task of the proletariat was not to defend the nation, but to turn the war into civil war against its own ruling class. This unwavering defense of orthodox revolutionary Marxism, maintained in the face of near universal capitulation, found its confirmation as the war deepened into social catastrophe. As conditions worsened, millions of workers and soldiers in Russia broke with the chauvinist parties and rallied to the Bolsheviks, whose growth from a persecuted minority into a mass revolutionary force culminated in the overthrow of the bourgeois state, establishing the first and last proletarian dictatorship since the Paris Commune. This position was further clarified through the experience of the ensuing counter-revolution. The current that would become the International Communist Party, first organized within the Communist Party of Italy under Amedeo Bordiga, insisted that imperialism is not a policy that can be reformed, but the highest stage of capitalism itself. As capitalism develops, it produces monopolies whose industrial capital merges with banking capital to form finance capital. And between rival finance capitals, the world is divided up among these competing militarized power who compete over resources and markets, making war inevitable. The rise of fascism in Italy was not an aberration, but a response of capital to crisis and proletarian revolutionary threat, just as democracy serves the same economic system under different conditions. In both cases, the function remains the same: to mobilize and discipline the working class in the interests of capital, binding it to the national objectives that mask the underlying unity of bourgeois domination. Fascism is nothing but the political form assumed by imperialism in crisis. As capital prepares for war and mobilizes the state to discipline the proletariat at home and confront its rivals abroad. During the Second World War, this analysis guided the party's unwavering opposition to all sides of the conflict. The International Communist Party rejected both Axis and Allied camps, denouncing the war as an inter-imperialist struggle in which the working class had no stake, while other organizations subordinated workers to national resistance or democratic fronts. The communist left maintained the line of proletarian defeatism, calling for the transformation of imperialist war into civil war against the bourgeoisie. This position was expressed in concrete activity, agitation among workers, support for strikes, and opposition to all forms of class collaboration, even under conditions of occupation and repression. Today, the International Communist Party continues to adhere to this invariant position. Imperialism remains the global system of capitalist domination, and war remains one of its necessary expressions. The capitalist class, when necessary, will always attempt to convince the proletarian to do the fighting in the next great war, presenting it, as they always do, as defense of democracy, national liberation, or supposed anti-fascist resistance. It is the role of communists to deflate all such fictitious noble causes. Proletarian defeatism is not a contingent tactic, but the only consistent revolutionary position in the face of calls to war. To oppose one's own bourgeoisie in every conflict, to reject all national divisions, and to recognize that the true enemy lies not abroad, but at home. Only through the reconstitution of combative class unionism organized in defense of workers' wages and against calls for sacrifice in the name of nation, led by a single centralized international communist party firmly rooted in the already well-defined and invariant programmatic directives of revolutionary Marxism, can the cycle of imperialist war be broken and transformed into a struggle for the abolition of capitalism itself. Right? These are the hard-learned programmatic lessons of the communist movement over the last 100 plus years that our party has continued to defend in anticipation of the future resurgence of the revolutionary movement. Next, we'll have our comrade present on imperialism, oil, and the war in Iran.
Comrades, the war in Iran is just the latest bloodbath conducted for the profit interests of world imperialism. Earlier this year, Iran experienced a deep economic crisis marked by currency collapse, soaring inflation, rising food prices, and declining living standards. As a result, mass protests and worker strikes emerged, which threatened the Iranian bourgeoisie to the extent that they massacred hundreds of workers in order to stifle the protests and hold on to power. Seizing the initiative, the United States, fresh on the coattails of its kidnapping of Nicolas Maduro, hoped to effect a similar decapitating maneuver in Iran, thinly justifying its blitz on the grounds of supporting democratic forces, yet simultaneously, as in Venezuela, openly and gleefully celebrating the health of the war for growing U.S. oil profits. We've all seen this before, haven't we? Hundreds, thousands, and millions losing their lives in the Middle East over the last century at the hands of this rotten, profit-driven war machine. Yet today, the wars are waged more and more aggressively to contain rival Chinese imperialism as the world capitalist system continues to confront a growing overproduction and profitability crisis. So it is that only the intervention of the proletarian can put an end to the growing proletarian genocide conducted on behalf of the profits of the capitalist class. The capitalist media would like us to believe that the wars are fought in defense of democracy or as the incidental consequence of a madman who aims to distract from his political woes. Yet they always aim to invisibilize the real economic interests of the ruling class in these conflicts and erase the existence of a common international proletarian class who has no reason at all to support these wars. always offering the illusory resolution to the madness in the bourgeois democratic processes. Yet, regardless of bourgeois propaganda, the war remains as unpopular as all of those waged by U.S. capitalist class over the last half century. This has never stopped the capitalist class from rampaging and bombing the world willy-nilly. The wars, so long as they continue to be fought, avoiding a mass draft, solely relying on America's professional military force, can be waged without any need to justify the conflict to the masses. Despite the threats of calling up a draft for the conflict in Iran earlier in the war, the U.S. capitalist class has found no will to do so. Could it be that even today they worry about the radical consequences if they were to arm millions of proletarian once again? As the carnage mounts all around the border walls of Fortress United States, its relatively higher wages and living standards here work to create a little island. A mirage which separates and divides the working class here from its international brethren. Thus, the impacts of these conflicts seem to pass by unnoticed by the proletarian here, which imagines itself merely as a collection of individuals who aspire most to comfort and personal gain, imbued with the inalienable bourgeois rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Pummeled by the counter-revolution and the all-pervading stain of the still remaining petty bourgeois residue from the frontier experience into adapting the value and the mask of its exploiters, unconscious of itself and separated from its party, becoming wholly depoliticized and demoralized as a class that almost doesn't exist. Yet this reality is only sustained by an objective situation, which is a true glass house, maintained by a fragile balancing game the bourgeois must play. With the growing overproduction crisis forcing wars, and each war growing the national debt, ever more attacks on the workers' wages and living standards guarantees a mass resurgence of the class struggle for bread, and the potential of a rearmed proletarian forced into an unpopular war points towards a future revolutionary cataclysm which cannot be avoided. Today's balance of forces will inevitably not hold, even if the fragile mirage of permanence and stability and comfort persists for the time being. The real enemy of the working class remains at home, not abroad, a plain material fact that the masses will sooner or later be forced to contend with. The growing instability of the capitalist world system can be seen all around. At the onset of the war in Iran, another quick and easy war was assured by the U.S. capitalist class. Yet 4 weeks later, the world was informed that the American military intended to, quote, wipe out an entire civilization. A day later, and the promised apocalyptic cataclysm was evaded without much explanation as a ceasefire was announced. For the U.S. capitalist class, it had accomplished many of its aims of growing its international oil market share, revitalizing profitability for its oil industry, which was at risk of slipping in decline, while the Iranian bourgeois had successfully mobilized nationalist sentiment and the militarization of society to strengthen its own stranglehold. A win-win situation for both, and hardly an all-out defeat for U.S. imperialism, despite the naive claims leftist third worldism make today. Yet the shock and awe antics of the U.S. imperialism and the volatile, bombastic negotiating strategy of its personified captain, Trump, are indeed symptoms of a stagnating world economy desperately working to leverage all the means at its disposal to maintain profit accumulation despite growing weakness and fragility. While Trump issued his typical litany of outrageous maximal demands throughout the conflict, in true cartel fashion, he made phone calls to Iran's ally, fellow petrostate Russia, negotiating oil prices and sales behind the scenes. As U.S. soldiers were shredded to pieces by Iranian drones, the U.S. Navy stood by and allowed Iranian oil tankers to sail on by so as not to let oil prices get too high. While the working class in the United States is asked to accept sacrificing its material well-being while suffering higher prices at the pump, American capitalists are filling oil tankers with millions of barrels of pillaged Venezuelan oil, offloading their product into Chinese markets, making billions in profits. A few weeks into the war, Trump openly celebrated how the rising oil prices made for the capitalist class a lot of money. Oil prices surged immediately after the war in Iran began in late February 2026, with crude rising from $80 peak to near $120 per barrel amid fears of disruption in the Strait of Hormuz. The rapid increase generated an estimated $60 billion in profits for U.S. oil producers, while boosting military spending, channeling billions into firms such as Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman. Yet the U.S. strategy has not aimed at total destruction of Iran's oil infrastructure. Instead, strikes were carefully calibrated to avoid triggering a complete supply shock that would have sent oil prices spiraling uncontrollably. Core export facilities remained largely operational, reflecting a deliberate attempt to manage, not eliminate, oil flows, illustrating the way under monopoly capital that war becomes a mechanism for regulating prices as ruling classes on all sides effectively calculate the level of destruction required to sustain profitability. As Lenin argued, control over key raw materials grant monopolies decisive power over the wider economic system. Oil remains central, supplying roughly 1/3 of the global energy and underpinning transport, industry, and agriculture. The oil industry is a highly cartelized global system where major producing states and firms, often coordinated through OPEC and allied producers, regulate output to manage prices rather than freely compete. The structure was put on full display during the 2020 crisis when a collapse in demand drove oil prices briefly negative, revealing the underlying contradiction of overproduction within a tightly controlled market. Because production costs in major fields can be as low as $3 to $10 per barrel, while market prices often range far higher, control over oil grants enormous monopoly rents over the past decades and centuries. However, the rise of U.S. shale production, expanding from about 5 million barrels per day in 2008 to over 13 million, has fundamentally disrupted this system, contributing to the 2014 oil glut and price collapse that devastated oil-dependent economies such as Venezuela, whose GDP contracted by more than 70%, creating the largest economic contraction in modern history, which the country still has not come close to recovering from. Following the lifting of U.S. crude export ban in 2015, American oil flooded global markets, while sanctions were increasingly used to restrict competitors such as Iran and Venezuela, cutting their exports by millions of barrels per day and expanding U.S. market share to roughly 13% of global trade. Yet this expansion faces structural limits. Shale production declines rapidly without continuous investment and depends on relatively high prices, above $50 to $70 per barrel, just to remain profitable. Prior to the war, prices hovered near $65, and the growth was expected to slow down even more. With the conflict, prices surged towards 100 and beyond, restoring profitability and incentivizing expansion, which has resulted in major new investments in U.S. oil infrastructure. The war thus functions as a mechanism for managing the overproduction crisis, as we have just shown, raising prices and redistributing market share while leaving the underlying contradiction intact. The war in Iran did not arise suddenly or from incidental political motives, but from a prolonged process of escalating sanctions, economic competition, and military intervention centered on global oil markets. U.S. imperialism has systematically targeted rival oil-producing states such as Russia, Venezuela, and Iran in order to weaken competitors that have helped fuel the industrial growth of China and increasingly India. As American industrial strength declines relative to its rivals, it has sought to leverage its position as the world's largest oil producer and dominant military power to maintain its financial supremacy. The strategy has unfolded through the combined use of sanctions, naval power, and control over global energy flows, linking conflicts across multiple regions into a unified struggle over the reorganization of the world oil market. The current war in Iran emerges from this process. Earlier rounds of sanctions, particularly in 2012, had already reduced Iran's exports significantly, But the turning point came in 2018 when the United States withdrew from the nuclear agreement and imposed a renewed maximum pressure campaign aimed explicitly at cutting Iran's oil exports to zero. This policy was enabled by the rapid expansion of U.S. oil production, which gave Washington greater confidence that it could remove rival supply without triggering a global shortage. As a result, Iran's exports collapsed from around 2 million barrels per day to as low as 200,000 by 2021, sharply reducing its share of the global oil market. However, this situation did not remain stable. Over the following years, Iran gradually rebuilt its exports, aided by the emergence of the sanctions-evading shadow fleet and shifting global trade patterns following the war in Ukraine. By 2025, Iranian exports had recovered to roughly 1.5 to 2 million barrels per day, with much of this oil flowing to Asian markets, particularly China. At the same time, other sanctioned producers such as Russia were also bypassing restrictions through similar networks, making enforcement for the U.S. increasingly difficult. In response, Western powers escalated from financial sanctions to more direct forms of intervention from the times of Biden administration through to the Trump, including ship seizures, port detentions, and naval patrols aimed at restructuring oil flows and maintaining pressure on rival producers. The cycle of sanctions and countermeasures increasingly took on a military character, culminating in repeated confrontations in the Persian Gulf. In February 2026, Iran seized tankers, conducted large-scale naval exercises, and temporarily restricted traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. U.S. and allied forces responded with escorts and heightened naval presence, while enforcement actions against sanctioned oil shipments intensified. These escalating maritime incidents, combined with the broader struggle over oil markets, steadily raised tensions, transforming economic conflict into open confrontation and ultimately leading predictably to the outbreak of war. As we've shown, this isn't merely the product of Trump's madness, as the liberals would like us to believe. This is a product of deeply ingrained economic interests of a capitalist class dictatorship that operates through both Democrat and Republican parties. Despite the war targeting Iran, the immediate losers from the disruption of shipping through the Strait of Hormuz are not Iran, but the oil-producing Gulf states, whose export systems has been physically constrained, militarily exposed, and commercially disrupted by the war. The Strait normally carries about 20 million barrels per day, roughly 1/5 of global consumption, but tanker traffic fell by more than 80% at the peak of the crisis. Gulf oil producers, especially Iraq, Kuwait, and Qatar, have been amongst the hardest hit, with exports falling by roughly 70 to 80%, in some cases over 80%, as the Strait of Hormuz disrupted and choked off shipments. As a result, their oil revenues have plunged, with Iraq and Kuwait seeing export income drop by around 3/4, while production cuts and stranded supply continue to erode profits across the region. While Gulf supply is constrained, rival producers are moving to capture the gap. Russia has benefited from higher prices and expanded flows to Asian markets, while Iran continued to export oil primarily to China despite the conflict. The United States captured more market share in India and is now projected to production rising to around 13 million barrels per day by 2027 as higher prices encouraged more drilling. Likewise, in the past few weeks, China has resumed and increased purchases of U.S. oil, marking a major capitulation on their part. At the same time, financial markets are adjusting to a prolonged disruption. Investment in new tankers capacity and U.S.-backed insurance programs for shipping indicate expectations that instability in global oil flows will persist, allowing non-Gulf producers to expand their market share. As Gulf supply becomes less reliable, the United States is actively seeking to capture its greater portion of demand, redirecting flow away from the Middle East. At the same time, the traditional energy order, long based in the petrodollar system and Gulf production, is being reshaped by U.S. shale, which has transformed former alliances into competitors. The war thus reflects not simply a regional conflict, but a broader struggle within a global oil market marked by overproduction, intense imperialist rivalry, and the ongoing reorganization of energy flows under monopolistic conditions. The early stages of the war in Iran already revealed a familiar pattern of modern imperialist conflict. Massive state expenditures and rising debt alongside private corporate gains. The United States spent over $11 billion within the first week of the war, with projections quickly rising towards $50 billion and potentially $200 billion to sustain operations. Meanwhile, a depleted missile inventory led to questions about the ability of the U.S. to sustain operations. While such wars generate windfalls for energy and defense corporations, they simultaneously deepen fiscal strain and reliance on borrowing. This contradiction is not new. From the financial crisis of 2008 to earlier wars, the limits of debt finance militarism have repeatedly surfaced when economic conditions deteriorate. At the same time, modern warfare is constrained by its own technological character. Advanced weapon systems are consumed far faster than they can be replaced, with production lagging years behind demand. This creates structural limits on sustained high-intensity conflict and raises the possibility that prolonged war may revert towards more labor-intensive forms, bringing the ruling class into direct confrontation with an increasingly armed proletarian. These dynamics unfold within a broader historical pattern linking war, debt, and social upheaval. From the fiscal crisis preceding the French Revolution, the destabilization caused by the Vietnam War and the revolutionary consequences of World War I, the combination of military expenditure and economic strain has repeatedly led to deepening economic and social crisis. Today, this contradiction appears in a more advanced form. Contemporary warfare is far more capital intensive than in the past, with systems costing millions or billions per unit, reflecting the highly financialized and debt-dependent structure of modern capitalism. As Engels observed, military power is ultimately determined by economic conditions, and the immense costs of modern armed forces reveals the underlying fragility of the system that sustains them. While war initially disciplines society, it also arms and trains the working class if conflict is prolonged, creating the conditions for potential revolutionary civil war. In the present period, the war in Iran reflects the deepening contradictions of global capitalism itself. It emerges from overproduction, intensified competition, and declining profitability, particularly within the global energy system, while unfolding against a backdrop of historically high debt levels. Unlike the Second World War, today's system is already highly leveraged, with total debt across the U.S. economy reaching roughly 250 to 300% of gross domestic product. As rising interest rates force governments to refinance large portions of their debt, a dangerous feedback loop emerges in which borrowing increasingly serves only to sustain existing obligations, rising the risk of financial crisis. War temporarily alleviates economic pressure by disrupting markets and raising prices, but it ultimately intensifies the underlying social contradictions. As economic conditions worsen and states shift the burden onto the working class through austerity and inflation, the convergence of crisis and militarization creates the conditions for renewed revolutionary movement. As Engels observed while predicting the rise of World War I decades ahead of time, large-scale war leads to the exhaustion of bourgeois states and crisis, creating the conditions for the emergence of the working class as a decisive force, once again on the historical stage. The present trajectory points towards a convergence of economic crisis and social conflict on a global scale. The war in Iran is not an endpoint, but a stage in a broader process of intensifying crisis. The ruling class may seek to manage this process through further war, repression, and economic adjustment, but they cannot escape the contradictions of the system they defend, which is inevitably destined for the dustbin of history. In the end, capitalism produces the conditions for its own destruction. By deepening crisis, escalating antagonisms, class antagonisms, and rearming the working class, it creates both the necessity and the possibility of its overthrow. We'll now hear about the relationship of Israeli and American imperialism in the conflict.
Comrades, throughout this war, we have heard endlessly that Israel is dragging America into conflict, that Netanyahu manipulates Washington, that AIPAC has purchased the Congress, that this is Israel's war and America is merely along for the ride. This explanation is everywhere. in the liberal press, among the anti-war movement, even among sections of the left. And it is fundamentally wrong. Not because the lobby is imaginary or Netanyahu lacks ambition. It is wrong because it mistakes the instrument for the architect. It lets Washington hide behind Tel Aviv, and it prevents any serious understanding of who this war actually serves. We begin where we always begin, not with ideology, but with the movement of capital. The United States has provided Israel with military aid since 1949, but the sums were small until the 1973 war, when aid jumped by an order of magnitude and settled at roughly $3 billion a year, where it has remained ever since. By 2009, virtually all of it was military. Civilian aid was phased out entirely. The United States is not funding Israeli society. It is purchasing a military function in the region. But the aid is not money. It is vouchers, redeemable only at American weapons manufacturers, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing, General Dynamics. Israel is required to spend the aid in the United States. Every dollar cycles back to Americans' arms capital. Even uniforms and combat rations that could be produced domestically are purchased from American firms because these vouchers must be spent. So when we hear that America gives $3 billion a year to Israel, we must understand what is really happening. America gives $3 billion a year to its own arms industry and ships the product to a client state. In real terms, adjusted for inflation, the aid peaked in 1979, and by 2010 had fallen to roughly a fifth of that peak. America pays less while demanding more. In 2016, the Obama administration signed a 10-year agreement phasing out, quote, offshore procurement, the unique privilege that allowed Israel to spend a fraction of the aid on its own military industry, a privilege that no other country ever has enjoyed. The agreement also bars Israel from requesting additional congressional grants for its duration. Obama called it a final offer. Israel signed. That is not a relationship between equals, it's a terms of subordination. We know the subordination because it was tested. In the 1980s, Israel attempted to build its own fighter jet, the Lavi, a direct competitor to American aircraft, a bid for military industrial independence. The United States crushed the project. They delayed technology licenses, commissioned a Pentagon report inflating cost estimates by 40%, insisted on veto power over third-party sales, and then offered competing American systems for free through the arms industry aid package. The project collapsed. Thousands of workers lost their jobs, and the entire Israeli arms industry was restructured around a new division of labor. The United States monopolizes combat platforms, tanks, jets, warships, while Israel produces only complementary components. Helmet displays for the F-15, navigation systems for the F-16, targeting optics, parts that plug into American equipment and compete with no one. AIPAC did not save the Lavi. The neoconservatives did not save the Lavi. When Israeli capital's interests genuinely collided with American capital's interests, Israel bent, and it will bend every single time. Locked out of competing platforms, Israel carved a niche, the technology of repression, surveillance systems, biometric identification, checkpoint automation, perimeter defense, riot control. All of it was developed through decades of military occupation, tested on a captive Palestinian population, then marketed globally as combat proven. After September 11th, this niche exploded. Netanyahu said the attacks were good for Israel because the global war on terror opened an enormous market for exactly the products Israeli companies already sold. 80% of Israeli arms production is for export, 4 times the American ratio. By 2012, nearly 5% of the Israeli workforce depended on the arms industry, a third of the industrial sector. The occupation is not separate from the Israeli economy. It is the engine of its most profitable sector. Every bombing campaign is a product demonstration, and every war is a trade show. The occupation itself costs the Israeli state more than it receives in American aid. That threshold was crossed around 1999. Security costs driven by Palestinian resistance run nearly triple settler subsidies. Israeli poverty is rising, schools are declining, social services are gutted, but the arms companies are booming. The costs are socialized onto the Israeli and American working classes. The profits are privatized into arms capital, security firms, and the broader circuits of international finance. Wars in the Middle East have been shown to dramatically increase the differential profits of oil and weapons companies globally, not just Israeli ones. The occupation generates permanent instability. Instability raises oil prices. Instability raises weapons demand. The Palestinian question remains unsolved not because no one can solve it, but because its unsolvability is profitable. This is the structure, and within this structure, the lobby performs a real but secondary function. We do not deny AIPAC's power. It can mobilize 70 Senate signatures in a day. It channels campaign money through dozens of PACs. It shapes discourse and silences critics, all documented. But the claim that the lobby causes American policy rather than serving it inverts cause and effect. The lobby succeeds because its agenda aligns with what major sectors of the American capital already require. The argument that Israel is a strategic liability only holds if you ask, liability to whom? For arms manufacturers, for oil companies, for the homeland security sector, the relationship is enormously profitable. The liability falls on American workers and taxpayers. But their interests have never been what bourgeois foreign policy serves. That is a distortion of the national interest. That is the normal functioning of imperialism, where costs are socialized and profits are privatized. And we note that those who most loudly advance the lobby thesis, when pressed on what they actually propose, do not call for ending American domination of the Middle East. They call for what they term offshore balancing, controlling Persian Gulf oil with fewer boots on the ground, so a more efficient imperialism. We must also be clear that we reject the conspiracy framework entirely. Our party's analysis on the Jewish question has always been clear. There have always been rich Jews and poor Jews, just as there are bourgeois and proletarians of every nationality. The arbitrary generalization that assigns to an entire people the characteristics of its ruling class, or worse, of a shadowy cabal directing world events, is the oldest device of reactionary ideology. It has been used against Jews for centuries. It is today used against Arabs, against Muslims, against every population imperialism needs to demonize. We do not fight this generalization with sentimental appeals or liberal moralizing. We fight it with class analysis. The Israeli bourgeoisie exploits Israeli workers. The Palestinian bourgeoisie, whether wearing the badge of the Fatah or Hamas, exploits the Palestinian workers. American capital exploits them all. The question is not one of peoples or races or religions. The question is, as always, one of class. Apply this to the present war. The United States is not bombing Iran because Netanyahu asked. The United States is bombing Iran because Iran is the last major obstacle to unchallenged American hegemony over the Persian Gulf energy corridor, through which a fifth of the world's oil passes. Because Gulf oil taken off the market raises prices to the sweet spot for American shale producers, because this war has already produced the first new American refinery in half a century. When Netanyahu appears to lead, when Israel strikes first, when Israeli intelligence provides targeting, what we are seeing is the sub-imperial enforcer performing its function enthusiastically, not the servant commanding the master, but the servant demonstrating its usefulness so the contracts keep flowing. And every time someone points at Netanyahu and says he is dragging America into this war, they perform a service for American capital. They let Washington hide behind its instrument. They let the architects of the war escape any scrutiny. This confusion is not theoretical. It is playing out right now. In the middle of this war, 3 weeks ago, Joe Kent, Trump's own director of National Counterterrorism Center, a Green Beret with 11 combat deployments, a Gold Star husband, and a loyal MAGA appointee, resigned in protest. His resignation letter claimed that Iran posed no imminent threat, that the war was started due to pressure from Israel and its powerful American lobby, and that Israel used the same tactic it used to draw America into Iraq. Tucker Carlson, who reaches tens of millions, called the war absolutely disgusting and illegal, and declared it Israel's war, not the United States war. Megyn Kelly blamed Israel firsters. Candace Owens, Marjorie Taylor Greene, and others piled on. A new stabbed in the back narrative is forming on the American right. The president was deceived by a foreign power into betraying America first. Notice what is absent from every one of these critiques. Not one of them asks who profited from the oil price surge. Not one mentions that US shale producers needed prices above $65 a barrel to remain profitable and got them. Not one mentions that the first new American oil refinery in half a century. Not one follows the money. Kent's framework protects American capital in its entirety. It says the problem is foreign manipulation, and the solution is a purer nationalism. Strip away Israel's influence, and American foreign policy becomes rational, peaceful, even benign. This is an illusion. American imperialism does not need to be tricked into war. War is what it does. War is how it manages overproduction, secures energy markets, disciplines rivals, and generates profits for the arms and oil sectors whose interests drive policy. Israel is a tool in this process, a willing and enthusiastic tool, but smashing the tool does not stop the hand that wields it. We have traced this pattern across decades. The national road has been tried exhaustively. In 1970, Jordan massacred Palestinians with the PLO and refused to organize the Jordanian masses. In 1976, Syrian troops besieged Tel el-Zatar for 52 days while Israeli ships blockaded by sea, and the PLO watched to preserve its diplomatic standing. In 1982, Beirut, the PLO defended the city but never armed the population, evacuated when the multinational force arrived, and the Sabra and Tashila massacre followed. In 1993, Oslo made the arrangement permanent. The PLO became the Palestinian Authority, a subcontractor for the occupation, a police force maintaining order in exchange for business in Israel's shadow. Each time, workers paid with their lives and the bourgeois collected their diplomatic rewards. The national road is closed. It was closed in 1948, confirmed in 1967, sealed in blood in 1970, 1976, 1982, 1993. Neither Iranian nationalism, nor Palestinian nationalism, nor Israeli nationalism offers any path forward. All are bourgeois programs. All require workers to die for interests that are not their own. What remains is the only road that has ever led anywhere, the class road, the independent organization of the proletariat across every border, against every state, against every bourgeoisie, Palestinian, Israeli, Iranian, American. The working classes of these countries share a common enemy. We said it in 1967, and we say it again tonight. Either they will fight together to destroy it, and the proletarians of the imperialist metropolises will give them the example of a battle that knows no frontiers of race, state, or religion, or it will be war again. There and everywhere, today and tomorrow, the system that compels this war also arms the gravediggers who will end it, and our task is to be ready.